All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CARB's Ocean-Going Vessel in-Transit Rulemaking Kickoff and Emissions Inventory Workshop. Again, apologies for the delay, had a few technical difficulties, but I think we're ready to get started.
Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a esta reunión de Ocean Going Vessel in Transit, por sus siglas en inglés. Vamos a estar comenzando ahorita con esta reunión.
So my name is Nikolai Densberger, and I'm the manager of the Marine Assessment Section, which is part of the Transportation and Toxics Division here at CARB. My team is tasked with developing a new regulation to help achieve reductions from ocean-going vessels. Okay, so Melissa, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. It looks like the language interpretation is working. Thank you for your patience. Here is our agenda for today. We are going to be taking questions throughout today using the Q&A function in Zoom. You can feel free to put questions in there at any time. We will have a Q&A portion after the rulemaking presentation and then after the emissions inventory presentation. You can also raise your hand to ask your question out loud, and we will also we will take both written and verbal Q&A during those Q&A sessions. Did want to kick off today with a few opening remarks from Bonnie Soriano. She's Chief of the Freight Activity Branch. Bonnie, would you like to go ahead and give a few remarks?
Yes, I would. Thanks, Nicole. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for our kickoff meeting for the in-transit ocean-going vessel regulation and updates to the OGV inventory. I'm Bonnie Soriano, the branch chief for the Freight Activity Branch, and we're in the Transportation and Toxics Division. And I'm trying to speak slowly so the interpreters can keep track of what I'm saying. So sometimes we forget and we start talking really fast, so I'm trying not to do that. This branch houses the in-transit regulatory team. This workshop is a cooperative effort between the program team and the inventory team, which is housed in the Air Quality Planning and Science Division. So you have two divisions at work here today, working cooperatively. I'd also like to thank the interpreters and also thank everyone's patience with the technology. Technology is great when it works and a little bit stressful getting it working. So everybody just take a deep breath. We've got everything working. So this is a public workshop, and CARB's public process welcomes and encourages participation from all affected stakeholders. And this includes environmental and community-based organizations, members of the public, industry, technology developers, engine and after-treatment manufacturers, academic institutions, and government agencies. Goods movement by ocean-going vessels is vital to California's economy, and we would like to acknowledge the efforts that industry and the ports have made over the years to address the air pollution impacts from this sector. However, despite these efforts, the existing regulations already in place to reduce emissions from OGVs, the OGVs continue to be one of the largest mobile source contributors of NOx, particulate matter, and diesel PM in our state. And further reductions from this sector are critical to protect the public health of impacted communities and meet the state's federally mandated air quality standards. Throughout the rulemaking, we look forward to productive collaboration and coordination with stakeholders, including industry and impacted communities, to develop a regulation that provides reductions essential to providing public health benefits to impacted communities. We also would like to give a big thank you to the inventory team in providing updates early in the process. And just as some background, inventory estimates provide the program team an essential tool to evaluate the impacts, effectiveness, and health benefits of any of the regulatory strategies that we will be developing in the upcoming months. And with that, I will turn the presentation back to Melissa Houchin, who will be providing the rulemaking portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Houchin. I'm going to be giving an overview of the regulation development process for this ocean-going vessel in transit rulemaking. I'd like to start by taking a moment to discuss the significant role that ocean-going vessels, or OGVs, play in air quality in California. Despite existing regulations already in place to reduce emissions from OGVs, such as the at-berth and vessel fuel regulations, OGVs continue to be one of the largest contributors of criteria pollutants in our state, particularly nitrogen oxides or NOx emissions. In 2023, OGVs accounted for 21% of statewide mobile source NOx emissions. However, projections from our emissions inventory indicate that by 2037, this is expected to rise to 26%. If no further reductions are achieved, OGVs will have an increasingly larger impact on our air quality compared to other mobile source sectors. To address this issue, we need substantial additional reductions in emissions from OGVs statewide. Now let's talk about the South Coast Air Basin, which is home to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the largest container port complex in the United States. These ports see a high volume of OGV visits, contributing significantly to the pollution levels in this region. OGVs and aviation alone are projected to be above the carrying capacity, which is the amount of NOx emissions that can be emitted into the atmosphere and still achieve attainment for the South Coast Air Basin in 2037. It has been challenging to achieve attainment of the national ambient air quality standards set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the South Coast Air Basin, which not only affects environmental health, but also the health of millions of residents. To support these communities and improve overall air quality in the South Coast, we must focus on reducing emissions from OGVs. This slide shows a similar figure for PM emissions, showing that in 2023, OGVs accounted for 9% of statewide mobile source PM emissions. However, projections from our emissions inventory indicate that by 2037, this is expected to rise to 14%. As we discussed earlier, the need for additional reductions from OGVs is critical not only for nitrogen oxides, but also for PM emissions. The 2022 State SIP strategy highlights reductions from OGVs as a crucial element in our overall plan to achieve federal air quality standards. Reducing emissions near ports is particularly important because it directly benefits disadvantaged communities that are often most affected by air pollution. This aligns with our commitment to support Assembly Bill 617, which aims to improve air quality for these communities. The South Coast Air Quality Management District, the California Air Resources Board, and the U.S. EPA recently recommitted to a long-term collaboration aimed at reducing NOx emissions from various sources in the South Coast Air Basin, including aircraft, locomotives, OGVs, non-road engines, and stationary sources. The joint agency statement and a letter outlining CARB's commitments can be read at the links shown on the slide. One of the primary commitments in CARB's letter of intent is to prioritize the development of an OGV in-transit regulation, which will play a key role in supporting this collaboration with South Coast AQMD and US EPA by specifically targeting criteria pollutants and toxics, which are not a focus of new regulations being considered by the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. It's important to note that while IMO is considering future international regulations that target GHG reductions from OGVs, these measures do not address the reduction of criteria pollutants such as NOx that California urgently needs to achieve. Achieving reductions in these pollutants, especially NOx, through an in-transit regulation is essential for the South Coast to reach its air quality attainment goals. Emissions from OGVs include criteria pollutants like NOx and particulate matter, or PM, but also air toxic contaminants like diesel particulate matter and greenhouse gases. NOx is a precursor for both fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, and ozone. Exposure to NOx is linked to several serious health issues, including asthma, respiratory symptoms such as coughing, wheezing, and overall difficulty breathing, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, which can lead to more severe health outcomes, especially among vulnerable populations, such as children and the elderly. Exposure to PM is associated with premature death, bronchitis, asthma, and for diesel PM, increased risk of cancer. By focusing on these toxic and criteria pollutants through the in-transit rulemaking, along with the expected greenhouse gas reduction co-benefits, we can help to protect the health of California residents, particularly those in vulnerable communities, and work towards achieving our air quality goals. Adverse health impacts associated with air pollution have a negative economic impact on California. A health risk analysis, or HRA, will be performed as part of the rulemaking process to assess the health and economic benefits of reducing emissions from OGVs. Here we have a visual representation of the regulation development process. I will go into more detail on the next few slides, but at a high level, we generally have 5 stages of rulemaking, from pre-regulation development activities to post-board approval activities. This slide gives a rough idea of how long a rulemaking generally takes, but these timeframes can be highly variable and can overlap. We are actively seeking input from the public and industry throughout the development process, starting in the pre-regulation development stage where we are now, all the way through the post-board approval activities. Public engagement, including community outreach and collaboration with stakeholders in industry, is crucial for our rulemaking process, as they provide valuable insights into the need for reducing emissions, how the industry operates, and what technology is available. It also helps us gather data to inform our rulemaking. Now let's walk through the timeline and various aspects of regulation development. In the pre-regulation development stage, we are establishing a baseline emissions inventory, engaging with community and industry stakeholders, conducting research, including technology assessments and contracts for specialized studies, and reaching out to interested parties to notify the public of our ongoing regulatory efforts. Right now, we are in this pre-regulation development stage, and this stage can take 1 to 2 years. Then we will move into the regulation development stage. This is where we begin to outline the framework of the proposal. We will host workshops and discuss draft concepts with stakeholders and the public, gathering input to further refine concepts. We will also begin conducting a cost analysis and health risk modeling to assess the potential impacts of our proposed regulations. This ensures that we made informed decisions based on both economic and public health considerations. Next, we will draft the regulation language, laying out the specific requirements and provisions. The regulatory development phase can take 2 to 3 years. Next is the formal rulemaking process, starting with the preparation of the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, along with the Form 399, which provides an early look at the expected economic impacts of the proposal. This document is submitted to the Department of Finance. An environmental review will also be conducted to evaluate the potential environmental impacts of the proposal, and we will also prepare an initial statement of reasons, or ISOR, which provides the rationale behind the proposal, along with the expected impacts and benefits. Once these documents are complete, we'll issue a public notice to inform stakeholders and the community about the proposed rulemaking and invite comments on the draft regulatory proposal. When this notice is posted, there will be a 45-day comment period for the public to formally comment on the rulemaking package, and a 1-year clock begins for us to get the proposal approved by the Office of Administrative Law. After the notice is posted, we will have a board hearing, and the board will vote on the proposal. If the board directs us to make any changes to the proposal, those changes will be posted and there will be an additional 15-day comment period for the public. If the board approves the regulation, we will post the final regulation language and resolution to our website. The final statement of reasons, or FSOR, will also be prepared following approval of the regulation. This is a document that compiles and responds to comments received from the public during all formal comment periods and during each board hearing. Then we will submit everything to the Office of Administrative Law for review and approval, and finally we will implement the regulation. As I've mentioned, there will be many opportunities for the public and industry to provide input on the regulation, both formally and informally. Informally, we will have workshops like this one held throughout the regulation development process, where we will ask stakeholders and community members to share their insights and concerns. We will also be developing a public outreach plan for better community engagement to ensure that all voices are heard, including those from communities directly impacted by emissions from port activity. We are considering hosting community-focused sharing sessions starting in 2025 to learn from community members that are impacted by port emissions and to discuss how to best incorporate communities into our in-transit rulemaking efforts. Then there are formal comment periods. As I mentioned, there is a 45-day comment period when the public notice is posted, and additional 15-day Administrative Procedure Act comment periods if any substantial changes are made to the proposal. The public can also comment during the board hearings. All formal comments will go into the FSOR and be addressed by staff and be part of the official rulemaking record. Any comments from the 45-day comment period that are related to the environmental analysis will be addressed in a separate document called the Response to Comments on the EA. Because we are so early in the rulemaking process, we do not have any specific draft concepts to share at this time, but I'd like to highlight some high-level ideas of what an in-transit rule might look like. We have identified 3 primary categories of potential measures to achieve emissions reductions from OGVs in transit: fuels, cleaner engines or vessels, or operational changes. Potential measures under each category could include, but are not limited to, regulatory requirements, voluntary actions, optional alternative compliance pathways, payments into a fund or spending account, or some combination of these elements. For example, a new or updated fuel rule could involve limiting carbon fuel intensity or criteria pollutant emission levels from fuels, or require the use of cleaner fuels. A cleaner vessel rule could involve requiring cleaner engines, such as Tier 3, or developing not to exceed limits for NOx emissions. An operational requirement rule could involve requiring a drop-in fuel replacement, limitations on anchoring emissions, maintaining performance at lower loads, or other operational changes. We are considering the best strategy or strategies and are currently working to understand what type of regulation is the best pathway to move forward. Part of that effort involves research contracts, which CARB is currently engaged in. CARB staff also welcome proposals and strategies from all stakeholders and impacted communities for evaluation. Please reach out to staff if you have any specific mechanisms that you'd like to discuss that may help us achieve necessary emissions reductions from OGVs. As I mentioned earlier, we are currently in the pre-regulation development stage of rulemaking, which involves a lot of research, including technology assessments and contracts for specialized studies. We currently have 2 ongoing contracts to support this rulemaking. The first contract is with UC Riverside for commercial hovercraft and OGV emissions testing. This contract is focused on testing commercial hovercraft main engines, as well as OGV main and auxiliary engines, both at anchor and in transit. We are also looking specifically at Tier 3 OGV main engines at low loads due to concerns that Tier 3 vessel emission factors may be significantly higher than the NOx standards when at loads generally below 25%. Because vessels transit at low loads when entering and exiting ports, this is a high priority for us to explore further as part of our in-transit rulemaking efforts. Additionally, we are exploring alternative fuels for OGVs, aiming to assess their performance and emissions profiles. The second contract is with UC Irvine and is focused on evaluating existing and upcoming technologies aimed at reducing emissions from OGVs, which includes an assessment of infrastructure and availability of alternative fuels and electricity. We invite anyone interested in being part of our testing contracts to reach out. Real-world testing will help us create more practical and effective regulations. By collaborating, we can ensure that the technologies we assess are not only innovative, but also feasible for widespread implementation. CARB is actively gathering data to support the rulemaking, and we've identified several key areas where additional information is needed. The first is fuel testing. We need comprehensive data on various alternative fuels, including biodiesel and methanol. This will help us understand the performance and emissions profiles of these fuels. Second, low-load emissions testing. There is a need for detailed emissions data specifically at low-load conditions. This will help us evaluate how OGVs perform under different operational scenarios. And the third is cost. Gathering cost data on engines, fuels, infrastructure, and other equipment will allow us to assess the economic feasibility of implementing new technologies and will ultimately inform our SRIA. And lastly, information on other advanced technologies that could reduce emissions or improve operational efficiency for ocean-going vessels. We encourage members of industry on the call to consider participating in our testing contracts to help us fill these data gaps. As I mentioned, we are in the pre-regulation development stage. Our next step in this stage will include outreach to community, environmental justice, and industry stakeholders, refining the OGV emissions inventory, and collecting essential information on data, all of which will ultimately inform the development of potential strategies. We will create a comprehensive community engagement plan to gather diverse perspectives and foster collaboration with communities and other relevant stakeholders. Our goal is to begin work on this community engagement plan in early to mid 2025 so that we involve communities early in the rulemaking process. Additionally, we will refine our OGV emissions inventory to ensure we have accurate data for analysis. Ongoing testing contracts will continue, allowing us to gather vital information on emissions testing. Results from our OGV technology assessment contract is expected by the end of 2025, and results for our emissions testing contract is expected by mid-2026. During this time, we will continue to engage with stakeholders to collect data on costs and technological advancements. Following this, we will explore and develop potential strategies for reducing emissions from OGVs. We expect this work to continue through early to mid-2025 and anticipate holding another workshop in mid to late 2025 to share updates on our progress and present further refined concepts for stakeholder input. This slide has our contact information and our website. We have a program email inbox at ogvintransit@arb.ca.gov. This will be the best place to send your questions or comments related to this rulemaking effort. We will now have some time for Q&A, but if for some reason you aren't able to get your question answered today, please do not hesitate to reach out to the OGV in Transit email inbox and we will follow up with you. And if you're interested in participating in our testing contracts, you can also email the inbox and we will follow up. I think we are ready to move into Q&A, so I'm going to pass it back to Nicole.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Trying to turn our video back on. Give me just a moment. Okay, thank you for the great presentation, Melissa. As she said, we're going to move on to Q&A, and we will first do some written Q&A, and then we'll move to the raised hands. I was going to say, for those of you that are using the raised hand feature to ask a question out loud, we will call on you individually and then give you permission to unmute yourself. And once we give you permission, you will have to unmute yourself to ask your question. If you are calling in on the phone, you can press pound and then the number 2 to raise your hand, and then star and the number 6 to unmute yourself. And this is a great time to throw that reminder out there that if you have not selected a language and hit mute original audio, we will not be able to hear you, just as many could not hear me a second ago. So that's a real world example. So I see we do have some questions in the written Q&A. Jackie B, did you want to go ahead and read us the first question?
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead. So the first question is coming from Michelle Garon, and she's asking, will the health risk
Can't
assessment...
hear Jackie now.
Oh,
No.
okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. All righty. So the first question is coming from Michelle Garon, and she's asking, will the health risk assessment cover the whole California coast or only certain areas?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So thank you. That's a really good question. Typically, health risk assessments that include, the air dispersion modeling and concentration and dose response values, and then translate into health impacts. Typically, they are sub-statewide because of the geographic geographic range basically has to be to the extent that we are able to essentially have the necessary processing power for all the metadata and all the air dispersion modeling and all the different components that go into it. So the answer is they're typically regional, which is smaller than the statewide. And for example, in At Birth, we looked at 2 regions. We looked at I believe the port of LA Long Beach, and then we looked at Richmond. And so to the extent that they are sub-statewide, any input that you have in terms of what those geographic regions should be, we'd be happy to talk to you about it. So that's one of the, in developing our program plan for the health risk assessment, that is one of the questions that we need to answer.
Okay. Thanks, Bonnie. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next question, Jackie.
Great. Next question is coming from Chilam Tabati, and Chilam is asking, can you talk more about how a testing contract looks like, or how does testing look like?
Bonnie, it looked like you wanted to chime in on this one.
I can take that one also. And we, in working with the OGV sector for many years now, we started working on regulations in the early 2000s. We have developed guidance on, standardized testing for ocean-going vessels, and those rely on international standards for testing. ISO, I think it's 8128. We have testing guidelines that we have published that's available on one of our websites, one of our main pages. And so if you'd like to see what those guidelines look like, we could provide those guidelines. And there are, really a very limited number of folks that are available to do that testing. And so it really depends on, whether they can meet the standards of the ISO test methods or not. So I'd be happy to, I don't know if we'll be able to drop a link in the Q&A or not, but we can follow up with you on providing those test guidelines.
Thank you, Bonnie. We can certainly do follow up. Let's go ahead and do a couple more of the written Q&A, and then we'll tackle raised hands.
Right, so Wendy Johnson asks, which regulation should I look out that defines an ocean-going vessel versus a commercial harbor craft?
I can start with this one. So I know that I believe both the fuel rule and At Birth regulation have a definition of what is an ocean-going vessel. So those are good regulations you can look at to see how we define an OGV. I am not as familiar with commercial hovercraft, Bonnie, but I assume there is a definition of a commercial hovercraft in that reg.
Yeah, the commercial hovercraft regulation has a definition of what a commercial hovercraft is. So again, if there are individual websites for all of these regulations: commercial hovercraft regulation, the ocean going vessel clean fuel regulation, the ocean going outberth regulation. And we could follow up, if you would like, if you have trouble finding those websites, we can point you to those websites and the regulatory documents that go along with that. And that would be the definitions would be in the regulations.
Yeah, our web pages can be a little difficult to find sometimes, but usually if you Google them, it'll take you to it, or please send to our inbox and we can connect you to the right pages. All right, Jackie, let's do another couple.
All right, next up we have Brian Wood Thomas, and he's interested in making a comment regarding UC Riverside and use testing of Tier 3 engines.
Okay, yeah, Brian, I can unmute you to make your comment. Let me just find you on the list here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Great. First, thank you for holding the workshop, and Brian Wood Thomas with World Shipping Council was particularly interested in the in-use testing that you're engaging UC Riverside on with respect to low load engines, and the presentation simply highlighted Tier 3 engines. As we conveyed to executives in California Air Resources Board in an August meeting, we are of the view that you should be really looking at Tier 2 engines as well, since Tier 3 engines constitute a very small percentage of the inventory, and Tier 2 is also affected by low load operations, which also degrades their NOx emission profile. So we would really encourage you to look at both classes of engines in terms of the in-use emissions. And I'm sure some of our members would be happy to participate in those tests. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for that comment. I just wanted to let you know that although we focus on, wanting Tier 3 emissions data, since there is a lack of Tier 3 data, especially at low load, we're not limiting the testing to just that tier. We would be open to testing Tier 1s and 2s as well, and also any alternative fuel vessels.
Great.
So
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
All right, thank you both. Let's do 2 more questions in the written Q&A, and then we'll jump to a couple of raised hands. So, Jackie?
Okay, so we have Elise Stirrup, and Elise is asking, is CARB wanting to model their policy off of any existing regulations in practice, like the EU MRV?
I can start with an answer, and Bonnie may want to add on since she recently attended an IMO meeting. At this point, we are looking at all options. Everything is on the table. Obviously, we know there's a lot of momentum building at the international stage to reduce emissions from ocean-going vessels. So we are taking a look at what's happening internationally, of course. Anywhere we can piggyback on that momentum, is a good idea, I think. I don't know, Bonnie, did you want to add anything from your recent IMO experience?
Yeah, I'll add. It was a fascinating experience to go to IMO. Many of the international measures really focus on, not all of them, I don't want to say all of them do, but a lot of them focus on greenhouse gases. And we need a combination of reductions in greenhouse gases, criteria pollutants, and PM, diesel PM. So to the extent that, yes, we're looking at those, and we have a large, one of the staff assignments is to, compile all the different international programs there are and how we can kind of leverage some of those. So we're definitely looking at that, but just that we have probably a more comprehensive list of pollutants that we need to include.
Thank you, Bonnie, and great question, Elise. All right, Jackie, let's do one more written Q&A and then we'll move to some raised hands.
So last up is Tyler Harris. He's asking, will you be considering, sorry, the question moved. Will you be considering mandatory speed limits as part of the rule? Reducing speed is a proven method of reducing criteria pollutant emissions.
Thanks for the question, Tyler. Again, I'll start with this one, and then anyone else who wants to chime in can. Again, I've said this a couple times, and you'll hear it a lot today. We are looking at everything. VSR, the vessel speed reduction, that is well established in a lot of the coastal areas of California. So we do know that there are benefits from reducing speed and reducing fuel consumption, but we are also concerned about this low load issue as well, and seeing emissions increases at these lower speeds and lower loads. So again, we're looking at everything, but we do have some concerns with low load emissions. I don't know if Bonnie or Lizzie, if you wanted to chime in on that at all.
Well, I think there's, the Port of LA Long Beach has a very successful program for vessel speed reduction, and I know the Bay Area have speed limits that impact their speeds. So as a statewide strategy, we don't think that in itself will get us the reductions that we need. So it might be a component, but I don't think it would be I don't think it will be the final and only strategy.
Okay, I would like to suggest moving over to raised hands for a little bit. So we've answered about 10 minutes of written Q&A. So I want to get a couple of these hands that are raised. The first person that's showing on my list with a raised hand is Teresa Bui. So I'm going to ask you to unmute Teresa, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Teresa Bui with Pacific Environment. We have a consultative status with the International Maritime Organization. Thanks to CARB for hosting this workshop on this important topic. I have more of a comment than questions. Emissions from ocean-going vessels are the top source of cancer-causing emissions at the Port of Oakland, Long Beach, and LA. So we're grateful for CARB for tackling this sector. We'll be sending in a coalition letter of over 22 groups urging CARB to adopt a zero-emission in-transit rule for OGVs to be phased in as soon as possible and to be fully effective no later than 2040. Reducing the in-transit pollution will benefit not just the port communities and port workers, but it'll also support innovation and jobs in the zero-emission marine technologies. And similar to cars and trucks, we need ships to go zero emission to save lives. CARB's sulfur fuel rule has prompted the IMO to adopt a similar global rule. So what CARB does have a ripple effect. The good news is that we're seeing zero emission shipping is possible with a combination of technology such as wind propulsion, battery, and zero emission fuels like green hydrogen. I know you mentioned that you are compiling a list of policies out there. We have commissioned a report by UC Berkeley that has all the different policies by countries, if that's helpful. Also wanted to share that a 2022 report shows that the pathway exists for battery electrification of container ships can happen within this decade to electrify over 40% of global container ship traffic. And so we're seeing rapid technological advancement and policy development in the maritime sector. And once again, we're also seeing that investing in zero emission shipping, like wind propulsion, battery, zero emission fuels, can help generate new jobs for dock and maritime labor unions, where UC Berkeley report found that decarbonization of shipping can generate about 316 jobs nationally. So again, we'll be following up with the letter as well as specific information on all the different policies out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Appreciate your comment and your help. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next hand raised, and that looks like Regina Sue. I'm going to ask you to unmute, so you can unmute and ask your question.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Great, thanks. This is Regina Sue with Earth Justice. I also just want to thank CARB for holding this kickoff workshop. The need for this rule to reduce emissions from ships in transit was identified by CARB about 2 years ago, I believe. And so we're glad that this process is starting and that there is a recognition of how necessary it is for attainment of not only basic federal air quality standards, but also to protect public health. I did want to ask if the team has a projection of how long it'll take to complete the remaining steps in the pre-regulation development, the community engagement plan, the emissions inventory and things like that. I also appreciate that CARB is planning to hold community outreach meetings, and just want to stress that input from communities, especially portside communities who are most affected, about the potential strategies and solutions, including alternative fuels and technologies, is critical. And I hope that those can be addressed in the research contracts that CARB is undertaking.
Hey, Regina, appreciate that comment. Yes, we are excited to kick off our community engagement plan. This is a new process for our division to develop a formal community engagement plan. So we will be looking, hopefully we can get in contact with you also to talk about the community engagement plan as we start to develop it and some of our other stakeholders. We're hoping to start that work early next year. And that is one of the first things we want to start working on next year, is that community engagement plan, to make sure the community members brought in, from the ground up. I can't. Oh, apologies. Thank you. The second part of your comment about how long the regulatory process takes, Melissa, could you pull up that timeline slide again for me? We have a slide in the slide deck here that shows a rough outline of how long it takes to do a rulemaking. We are anticipating, this is a large rulemaking, so we are expecting it to take in the 4 to 5 year time frame. There are a lot of components to it. Obviously, we're getting started now in the very early days of the rulemaking. We're doing a lot of research and a lot of technical work before we move into the formal rulemaking period. I think we're having trouble getting the slide up, but we're anticipating probably in the 2028 timeframe, maybe 2029 of going to the board, but we don't have a firm date in mind. Don't know if anyone else on the team wants to weigh into the timeline, but we are happy to have further discussion about that.
Yeah, thank you. That estimate is helpful. We understand that regulatory development takes a lot of time. I do also want to stress, our portside communities need relief now. I think part of the impetus for this recognition about the need for this regulation were the immense impacts from ships in 2021. And that year the South Coast Air Basin experienced an increase in NOx emissions from ships at anchor that was equivalent to total emissions from 5.8 million passenger cars and 100,000 Class 8 diesel trucks. That's on top of the ongoing elevated levels of pollution that communities living near ports of LA and Long Beach already experience. So, they need relief now. And so we hope that CARB will prioritize this rule, focus on shifting ships coming to California ports to zero emissions, and go to the board in 2027. Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. And we do understand there's definitely an urgent need to get these reductions from ocean-going vessels. And I know our staff is motivated to move as quickly as possible while trying to be as diligent as possible with our technical analyses. So thank you so much for your comment. Going to go on to another raised hand. We're eating up our time quickly. I know emissions inventory is chomping at the bit, so we're going to take a couple more hands, and then we may have to do follow-up after the workshop. The next hand that I have raised is Thomas Jelinek. I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question.
Thanks, Nicole. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I actually have a several questions. I guess I'll go down through them all, and you can go. My first question is regarding the comparison of the geographic scope of the inventory versus this specific effort. The inventory, as I understand, is 100 miles offshore. I'm presuming, but maybe I shouldn't, that this effort is not going to cover activities within the entire inventory scope. If that's the case, then one of the asks I would have is to, as you develop the inventory, bifurcate the inventory between what the activities that would be covered under this effort. And you will probably need to do that anyways if you're going to be engaging in something like HRA for areas like Southern California and the Bay Area. One of the things that concerned me in the presentation is when you look at the mobile source strategy, under OGVs, there's a whole slew of measures that are considered, including voluntary measures. And this presentation seems to be focused entirely on just regulation. As was pointed out, the vessel speed reduction program has been a voluntary program that's been highly successful, reducing emissions here in Southern California. And I'd ask as part of this effort to broaden the scope of what you're looking for, because there are certain things that are within CARB's authority. There are certain things that may be outside of CARB's authority. Vessel emissions are among the most challenging emissions to tackle. And I think we should take a more comprehensive view rather than focusing, making a decision right off the bat that the regulation is the right answer. So I'd ask you to look at that as part of that process. And as part of that, I think already folks are feeling time constrained on this workshop. I would encourage you to do maybe a half day or even longer workshop in person where people can have a roundtable discussion, because these are really complex issues in terms of tackling emission reductions, where those emission reductions from what activities, and how they will impact both operational characteristics and onshore air quality. And I think that would be a really good discussion to have with less time constraints. I also wanted to ask if staff can, when they describe some of the efforts, some of the measures under this effort they were considering, some of them sounded like emission standards, which I think there may be some disagreement of whether or not that is within CARB's authority for vessels. And wanted to understand, are you targeting emission standards for vessels? And if so, how do you see that working? And then I think my final comment is, I noticed you talked a lot about different alternative fuels. One of the potential alternative fuels, and one that's often considered sort of the end fuel for ocean-going ships, is ammonia, and that wasn't mentioned. And I would hope you would consider evaluation of ammonia in there. There are, while we don't know how things are going to turn out, there are a lot of folks that think that ammonia may be the final solution when it comes to carbon-free vessel fuels. So those are my comments. I'm hoping more of a back and forth, but.
Thanks, Thomas. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know if we'll be able to address all of your comments at this point, but we did get a lot more interest in today's workshop, I think, than we initially thought. So this will definitely not be our final workshop. This is just a kickoff, but we expect a lot more conversation. I would say that we listed some things that we're looking at on the slides, and in the speaking notes, we didn't talk about everything, but we are considering everything at this point. We know ammonia is a fuel that's being talked about a lot. So we are looking at all different fuels and all different options. Bonnie, was there anything you wanted to respond to?
I think, we're not focusing on emission standards. And so I wouldn't say that's a focus. At this point, we're looking at everything. And yes, we're looking at all fuels that we think might be feasible in the future. But one thing I did want to point out in the part of the voluntary discussion too, we are open to ideas about regulatory strategies, about voluntary strategies, about incentive-based strategies. I mean, I don't think that at this point we want to limit it to any of those. And so, you know, to the extent that there are ideas about what voluntary strategies would be effective and implementable, we'd be very happy to have those discussions. And I think we do recognize that there are voluntary strategies that have been important and have been effective. So I think the answer to that is yes, we're open to having those discussions. Today is really a high level. We're going to really, over the next year, roll up our sleeves and have a lot of these discussions. And so we look forward to having those discussions. And we, you know, are open, as we've said, there are, you know, we have not focused on any single strategy or strategies at this point. And so now is the time to have these discussions. So we would welcome having those discussions.
Thank you. One last thing I'd just like to add, if when you present your inventory information as well, if you can also present it by, you know, geographically delineate the inventories, present it by air basin, and also do the comparisons to the total inventories rather than just the mobile source category, because when it comes to attainment and public health, it's the total inventory that we're ultimately controlling for. So I'd ask you to consider presenting the emissions inventories with those things in mind in the future. Thanks.
Thanks for your comment, Thomas. And I was going to add, David Kuros also mentioned to me that they did post the Excel tables that delineate emissions by 0 to 3 nautical miles, 3 to 24, and 2400 nautical miles on their website, if you're interested in viewing that.
But only out to 24? Because I thought your inventory goes,
Well,
and that would
0
be
to 3 to 24, and then 24 to 100.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're going to go ahead and take one more raised hand, and then we're going to move to the emissions inventory portion so that we can get their presentation in, and we can take some more Q&A at the end of the workshop after their presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and ask David Woolley to unmute himself and ask his question.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Woolley. I direct the Environmental Center at the Goldman School of Public Policy. And I've got a comment rather than a question. And I want to thank CARB staff for their work to date on this very important issue. Our center has been involved in research associated with emissions from port and shipping for about 7 years now. And most recently, we produced a set of papers in May 2024 looking at opportunities and policy options to reduce emissions from shipping. And so we come away from that research with two conclusions. One is that the technology is there to achieve very deep reductions in emissions from ocean-going vessels. But it's also very important to also begin the process now of setting up supply chains for alternative fuels, because that appears to us to be one of the barriers that has to be addressed. We also conclude that CARB has authority to get very deep reductions in emissions from vessels, and that the benefits for public health and the environment really are very large here and justify moving the regulation as fast as possible. So we urge CARB staff to take a look at ways to complete the process faster than the projection that was described earlier in the briefing. So thank you very much for your efforts on this. Very glad to see CARB initiate this effort, and we hope to participate in the process going forward. Thank you. And I've posted a link to the papers that we produced in May of 24.
Thank you very much, David, and appreciate your comments. I am going to go ahead now and pass the mic over to Nancy Bowie so we can get started on the emissions inventory portion of this presentation of today's workshop, and then we will, again, handle more questions and answers once Nancy's done with her presentation.
Thanks, Nicole. I'll just very briefly say I'm Corey Farmer, manager of the off-road inventories, and I'll hand it over to Nancy Bowie, who's our lead on the OGV emission inventory. And before we even start, one thing to just emphasize is we're We're going out very early with this emission inventory in draft form to be sure we have a lot of time to get comments and take feedback. This isn't a final inventory. This is just the beginning of the process to collect feedback. And we already have a number of meetings set up with different industry groups and ports, but if you're interested in that, just reach out to us. This is the right time to do that, where we can still make changes and updates in the inventory. And just also thank everybody for your interest and your time. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nancy.
Okay, I think I've got it. Hopefully that's showing. So thanks for being here. This is, again, the second half of today's workshop. In this portion, we're shifting away from talking about the upcoming rulemaking and instead focusing exclusively on draft updates to our statewide emissions inventory for ocean-going vessels. As a quick reminder, if there are any questions or comments during the presentation, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom to enter the queue. If you're joining us via phone, please press #2 to raise and lower your hand, or *6 to toggle your mute. Also, if you'll be referencing content from a particular slide during your question, please keep a note of that slide number for us. It'll help us transition to that slide a bit faster during your comment. We're accepting verbal comments today, but please note that you also have the option of submitting written questions and comments to our inventory inbox. That's off-road inventory at arb.california.gov. We'd like to emphasize again, I know Corey just mentioned it, today's workshop is intended to kickstart that conversation as we work through this initial draft. So there's still plenty of time to send in your thoughts. We'll be accepting comments and supporting data again through the end of January 2025. Also, in case you'd like to reference your own copy of the slides and or detailed documentation of the methods we're highlighting today, I'm listing those web links on the slide here. Also on our website is that Excel spreadsheet with the draft output broken out by air district, year, vessel type, and distance from shore. We won't be taking questions until the end of the presentation, so please go ahead and raise your hand if you already know you'd like to enter the queue. At the end of the presentation, I'll show this slide again, and that's when we'll open up the floor for questions. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Just to be clear, this inventory covers a specific subset of marine vessels. I know we briefly touched on it a bit earlier. It doesn't include all commercial marine vessels, it's just ocean-going vessels. So those are the commercial ships that are more than 400 feet in length, have a carrying capacity greater than 10,000 gross tons, engine displacements more than 30 liters per cylinder, and are operating within 100 nautical miles of California shoreline. We do include all OGVs moving through these waters, even if they're just passing through and don't stop at a California port. Okay, so our emissions inventory estimates pollution of OGVs, considering the vessel characteristics, such as the number of ships and the size, the energy generated by each engine type, the location and speed of those activities, that's like time spent using emissions controls, and we anticipate future populations and growth rates. So what we get from making this kind of inventory is the expected emissions from statewide OGVs, starting from 2024 in this update all the way out to calendar year 2050. That information is really critical for us here at CARB to understand what emission levels might look like in the future, and it helps us better inform where we might need to move more resources to decrease those pollution levels. In this slide, we're looking at the contribution of all mobile source sectors to statewide nitrogen oxide or NOx pollution in calendar years 2023 to the left and 2037, excuse me, on the right. The share of NOx coming from OGVs is highlighted in yellow. And as you've seen earlier, when you look from left to right, you can see that over time, it'll be increasingly more critical for us to reduce levels of NOx coming from the OGV sector. Again, there's a slide on PM where we're focusing on statewide particulate matter. This is just from mobile source combustion. So comparing 2023 with 2037, we can see that aircraft and OGVs are the only mobile sources expected to increase their share of statewide PM emissions. Again, emphasizing the need for us to reduce emissions from these two sources. This slide outlines the data sources used to develop our statewide inventory. On the far left, going down, we have listed our data categories. In the center, we have the data sources listed for each of those categories that were used in our prior inventory. And then on the far right column is where we have the data sources we relied on for this draft inventory update. This is what we're workshopping today. And the main thing to note from this slide is that between the center and the right columns, the data sources themselves have not changed. We're using the same information as we did in our last inventory. We're just updating to the most recent versions for each of these data sources. Okay, and here is the geographic domains we'll be referring to throughout this presentation. You can see the state of California in gray on the left-hand side, and then the extent of each of the distances from shore that we'll be talking about. Yellow is that area out to 3 nautical miles, dark blue out to 24 nautical miles, and that green turquoise color is the area out to 100 nautical miles, and we do include those islands. On the right side, we're focusing specifically on South Coast Air District because this air district and the San Pedro Bay ports use a different domain in their emissions inventories that they develop compared to the ones we've developed here at CARB. So what I have on the right is that slice of our inventory that we attribute to South Coast AQMD out to 100 nautical miles, still color-coded in the same manner. Overlaid on top of that is the boundaries used by the other inventories, those developed by San Pedro Bay Ports and the Air District, where they base their inventories on a certain distance from a single point of reference. And on the map here, that's Point Furman. This includes that 20 nautical mile bubble around that point. We also have marked the 40 nautical mile bubble, and then that rectangular block that's referred to as the overwater boundary. I highlight the differences here to make clear that the 20 and 40 nautical mile distances in their inventories are not the same as the distances I'm referring to in our presentation today. When I talk about the distances in the following slides, it's always referring to total distance from California shoreline as shown on the left. Okay. We use AIS as our activity data source in this inventory. AIS stands for Automatic Identification System, and all OGVs are required to have these transponders on board. They're mainly used for navigation devices. They improve safety essentially by letting ships know where other ships are, how fast they're going, and where they're heading. This helps reduce the number of collisions that happen in the ocean. This massive data source is free and publicly available through collaboration of several agencies listed on this slide. We've also included the link under the image to show you where we have pulled our AIS data for processing into this draft inventory. On this slide, we define 4 modes of operations for OGVs. So where At berth refers to when a ship is tied to a dock. Anchorage refers to when a ship drops their anchor at a designated anchorage location. It's often waiting for their turn to berth at a port. Maneuvering is the slow speed operations, typically with guidance from smaller commercial hovercraft within port areas. And transit refers to those higher speed movements between the ports. Okay, with all that background information out of the way, we're going to jump to the next section, which covers how we estimated emissions for our base year. Emissions are calculated based on 3 overarching factors: total time, power use, and the emissions rate. So to understand total time a vessel is running, we rely on AIS data and subtract out the total time the ship spends using emission controls. For power use or fuel consumption, we need to understand more details about the ship. So that's where we rely on vessel registries and reporting to help us understand what's unique about each ship, including the engines they run, when they were built, how large they are. And we use real-world data, such as the vessel boarding program, to help us further understand the typical power demands of these ships. Emissions rates are derived from a combination of emission factors for each pollutant and any low-load adjustments, which essentially takes into account that engines may be less efficient, releasing more pollution when they're operating at lower loads. Okay. So the biggest change in our inventory update is our approach to the base year. Base years are important in emission inventories because they serve as a foundation for all of our future forecasted years. Previously, the base year included emissions from just a single year, so our forecast might carry with it any abnormalities observed in that base year. For example, if emissions in that year happen to be unusually high or low due to exceptional events, we would see those extremes for all pollutants estimated through to 2050. So in order to address those concerns, we're proposing to use a surrogate base year this time. This is where we average all vessel activities within the last 5 years. So it's going to include 2019 through 2023. This approach essentially means that we aren't ignoring extreme events in our forecast. But at the same time, exceptional events that do occur in a single year don't unreasonably dominate our future year estimates. The timeline depicted on this slide played a large role in helping us develop our proposed approach to the base year. So here you are seeing historical events that impacted water shipping operations over the last 15 or so years. What we can see from this timeline is that exceptional events occur quite regularly, and there is at least one in every 5-year window over the last 2 decades. And so that leads us to believe 2 things. The first is that none of these events should be ignored. And the second is that we can reasonably assume that there will be some sort of disruption to water shipping in the future. Our proposed 5-year average surrogate base year is a way to acknowledge these trends, and we're very much interested in your thoughts to this approach, especially if you have additional data for us to consider. Okay. This slide outlines how we look at the activity data and allocate different modes of operation. We aligned quite closely with the US EPA's recommendations by considering speed and location of the ship. Berth operations are defined as within port areas, not in designated anchorage zones, and without vessel movement. For example, in this figure at the center of the slide highlights the data points we flagged as berth hoteling in neon blue, where you can see the results are quite reasonable using this methodology. Anchorage is determined by operations less than 1 knot within designated anchorage zones. Maneuvering operations are within the ports at speeds less than 1 knot, and all other operations are considered transiting. Now, this method is exactly the same as our last inventory. The only change is that the EPA shifted their recommendation. You can see when we normally had the speed threshold of 3 knots, they've shifted that down to 1 knot, and that's the main change here. Okay, in California, vessels at berth may be required to reduce their emissions, and that really depends on the port and the vessel type. And to reduce emissions, ships have the option of plugging into shore power or using any other CARB-approved emission control strategy. So in the table, we have the results of emission controls for all currently regulated ports observed in 2023 based on our enforcement reporting. And we have that split out by vessel type at these ports. The bottom row shows the year each of these vessel types have at-berth requirements. I just want to make a quick note that I'm only showing ports here with requirements in 2023, and the table does not include ports such as Richmond that see ro-ros and tankers because they don't have requirements until later in 2025 and 2027. Surprisingly, based on these 2023 observations, ro-ro ships in the Port of Oakland are already achieving high emission control rates ahead of their 2025 target. I'm sorry, going to take a quick water break. Okay, I'm back. We use our 2023 vessel reporting data where available, specifically to get information like engine tier, the use of emission control, fuel types, and whether the ships have steam-driven pumps in the case of tanker vessels. Otherwise, we rely on IHS vessel registry data for all other information collected at the time of the ship's build. For example, max speeds, engine types, and capacities. How we determine engine type is consistent with the US EPA, where slow speed engines have less than 500 revolutions per minute. Additionally, where tier information isn't available to us, we do define engine tiers based on the vessel's keel laid year, as shown in the table on the right. To understand the total power being output by the main engines, we rely on minute-by-minute reporting from AIS to fill in variables for the propeller law, shown in the middle equation on this slide. AIS gives us the speed the vessel is currently moving, while IHS registry data provides us with the vessel's maximum speed and the total power the main engines are capable of outputting. The unfortunate thing is no data source is perfect, right? And IHS registry does have some limitations. For example, maximum speed is not reported for every vessel. So what we did was we looked at the records where maximum speed was reported, and we plotted them against another field, service speed by vessel type. And that's what you see here. There's a clear linear relationship between maximum speed on the vertical axes and service speed on the bottom axes. So for ships where we did not have maximum speeds, we used this linear relationship with service speed to fill in those gaps so that we can calculate main engine power from these ships. load is the percent of the main engine's maximum power being used. Here we show the distribution of main engine loads within 100 nautical miles of shore, where the bottom axis is the percent of the main engine load, and the vertical axis on the left shows the total percent, whether or not you're looking at the gray bars, which represent hours, or the blue bars, which represents NOx emissions. So as you can see here, while ships spend a large portion of their time at lower loads, the lowest load bins on the left contribute a smaller percentage to the overall total NOx compared to time spent. On the right side is where you can see that ships spend considerably less time at the highest loads when they're zooming through the water. But these loads bins contribute relatively more emissions per time spent. Moving on to NOx emission factors. NOx is the only pollutant that shifts with engine tier standards and engine speeds. So in this figure, we have engine years across the bottom axes, NOx emission factor in grams per kilowatt hour on the vertical axes. Each line depicted in the figure is a different engine type. And you can see the emission factors drop with each new engine tier standard over time, where Tier 3 engines implemented after 2016 are the cleanest engines currently available for OGVs. At the bottom in the dotted line, you can see that boilers aren't subject to engine standards, so that's why the emission factors remain unchanged over time, despite the updated engine tier standards. Moving on to low load adjustment factors here. I'd like to draw your attention to the figure where the bottom axis is the percent engine load, and the vertical axis on the left is the low load correction factor. That dashed curve in the figure is the low load curve that was used in our prior inventory, while the solid line is the updated low load curve that we've based on real world testing data, and that was collected by the ports of LA and Long Beach through the vessel boarding program. You can see that compared to our prior inventory, our proposed correction factors are lower for engine loads below 5%. When you look at the comparison between the 5% and 35%, they are higher. But it is relatively the same for engine loads greater than 35%. What this means is that areas across the state that see more activities at engine loads below 5% may see emissions reductions, while areas that see more activities between 5 and 35% engine loads may see emissions increases from this change in low load corrections. We align, like I mentioned before, we align all emission factors with the US EPA, and their factors have largely remained unchanged from the previous inventory iteration, except for a slight decrease in Tier 3 emission factors that's shown on this table. Unchanged from the prior inventory method, we're still reflecting all Tier 3 engines operating under 25% load as if they're emitting at Tier 2 levels with low load corrections. This is something that the EPA has recently incorporated in their method into their latest 2022 guidance as well. And to show you how that's implemented, we'll look at this next slide where we're showing main engine load across the bottom axes with NOx emission rates with low load corrections on the vertical axes. So that dashed line is Tier 2 modeled NOx emissions, and that solid blue line is how we're modeling Tier 3. As you can see, any Tier 3 operations below 25% engine load follow that Tier 2 engine curve with low load corrections, but activities above 25% follows the expected Tier 3 curve. Here we show the tier distribution for all OGV observed statewide out to 100 nautical miles from 2019 through 2023, where the bottom axis is the keel laid year and the vertical axis is the total OGV population. Using CARB's 2023 vessel reporting data, we can see that using keel laid year to estimate engine tier isn't perfect. So, for example, if I could draw your attention to the yellow bars in between 2000 and 2010, at the top of those bars is a little bit of blue representing Tier 2 engines. So some ships have different engines, but for the most part, the data is showing us that keel laid year is a relatively accurate method for determining engine tier. Another thing to note from this figure is the substantial amount of keels laid in 2015, which happens to be just before the Tier 3 engine standards went into effect. To this day, we don't see many Tier 3 ships coming to California ports, so most of our visits are from ships from Tier 2 or Tier 1 engines. Okay, that concludes the summary of our surrogate base year. So now we'll be shifting topics into our forecasting assumptions. This section outlines how we were taking what we learned from the surrogate base year and projecting emissions out into future years. So the first thing we'll cover is growth. In this draft inventory, we've relied on the Freight Analysis Framework, or FAF. That's version 5.1. This model was developed by the Department of Transportation and projects freight totals by mode of transportation. And we compare these growth rates with the San Pedro Bayport maximum throughput as defined in their 2018 master plan, just to make sure the projections don't exceed operating capacity at the ports. While we present FAF growth rates in this presentation, I do want to note that we're currently reviewing the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC's, forecast for unique growth rates to be applied at the Port of Oakland. That would be similar to what we did in the prior inventory, so we do plan on doing that again before this inventory is finalized. Okay. This figure shows annual growth rate projections for containerized cargo by region. So as you can see, the growth in 20-foot equivalent unit shipping containers, or TEU growth, is estimated to be around 3 to 3.5% out to 2050 in the Los Angeles region. Now, FAF estimates Oakland region to be around 2.5% growth, but if we use the BCDC report, that percentage will be slightly lower after we apply those changes. I'd like to emphasize that containerized cargo growth rates do not directly equate to growth in vessel visits. So for example, given the considerations I'll outline in the next few slides, while TEU growth for San Pedro Bay ports is projected between 3 and 3.5%, the estimated growth in vessel visits would likely only translate to about 1.1% growth as a point of reference. But before I dive into those details, I'm going to shift briefly to emission controls. So this slide might look familiar because it's taken directly from the 2023 enforcement reporting presented earlier. Only this time we're looking at it from a different lens. So this time we're looking at it from the perspective of forecasting future year compliance rates for ships to reduce emissions using CARB-approved emission controls. So we use observed 2023 container ship compliance rates as a surrogate for future year compliance for ro-ro and tanker ships in future years. There are some exceptions to the rates that we've applied. For example, because ro-ros in Oakland were already observed in 2023 with 68% emission reductions, we maintain that rate through all future years. And for the Port of SF, which doesn't see container ship visits, we assume that ro-ros and tankers would reduce emissions at the rate of 80% per regulatory language by 2025 and 2027, respectively, in San Francisco. So another thing to note is while we recognize tanker ships are required to reduce their emissions while at berth at these ports, we're also aware that many tankers plan to earn credits by paying into a remediation fund. Right now, we plan to model tanker compliance using remediation funds, but we'd love to understand your thoughts on this topic. Okay, this slide shows container ship capacity trends over the last 20 years in terms of total arrivals at the San Pedro Bay ports, broken out by TEU capacity of the container ships. As you see in the blue, container ships less than 4,000 TEUs in capacity have seen a declining trend over time, and we're observing that there's a bit of a plateau in the last 5 years at a relatively steady rate of arrivals for these vessel sizes. Ships between 4,000 and 8,000 TEU, shown in the black line, have also seen a decreasing trend over time. But for this category of ships, we're unsure if this vessel category will also plateau at some point, similar to the blue line, or if they'll be replaced by higher capacity ships. So as shown in the yellow, more ships, larger ships greater than 8,000 TEU in capacity, have been calling to the ports more frequently over time. In this figure on the right, if I could draw your attention there, we can see that historical total TEUs at the San Pedro Bay ports have increased over time. And so combining those concepts with the last slide, this tells us that freight growth since 2012, the growth in TEUs has largely been met by increases in the larger ships, so vessels over 8,000 TEU in capacity. That's why when we apply growth to container ships, we only apply growth to ships above 8,000 TEU in capacity, and they're only grown enough, to meet the overall freight growth from that FAF 5.1 projection slide that I showed you earlier. No growth is applied to container ships less than 8,000 TEU in capacity. So as mentioned before, while vessel visits from ships less than 4,000 TEUs have appearingly reached a plateau, there's a bit of uncertainty for us about if vessels between 4,000 and 8,000 TEUs would plateau in the future or be removed from service over time. So this is a knowledge gap for us, and we'd appreciate any data that you might have to help us fill in those gaps. Okay, so for now, this is a visual depiction of how we're applying growth by TEU capacity of container ships. On the bottom axis is the calendar year with throughput in millions of TEU on the vertical axes. As you can see, no growth is applied to ships less than 8,000 TEU in capacity. That's the turquoise green and yellow areas. And instead, they're maintained at the same rate they're observed in the surrogate base year. All of our growth is applied to container ships greater than 8,000 TEU in capacity, but at no point does the overall throughput exceed the TEU capacity of the San Pedro Bay ports as defined in their master plan. Okay, so regarding Tier 3, based on the distribution shown earlier, we know that California ports rarely have visits from the newest container ships. There was a substantial number of builds ordered just before the Tier 3 engine standard introduction in 2016. So while the ships may not have finished construction until after 2016, a Tier 2 engine was installed on these ships. So that makes keel laid date a more accurate metric for estimating engine tiers than using the year the ship finished being built. We maintain the level of Tier 3 ships we observed in the surrogate base year, but additional Tier 3 visits are delayed until 2030, and this is based on a report by Mercator International that was commissioned by the San Pedro Bay ports. Okay, so moving on to emission results. After all these changes and assumptions have been taken into account. Here we break out NOx within 100 nautical miles by activity in each of the 5 years between 2019 and 2023, including the average surrogate base year on the right side of each of these figures. But for the most part, emissions are a bit variable from year to year. They're predominantly coming from transiting activities between statewide on the left and then South Coast on the right. When we focus in on South Coast, we can get a clearer picture of the impacts of the port congestion event in 2021, as well as how those impacts, while included in our surrogate, aren't as pronounced in our 5-year averaged base year surrogate. That surrogate is then what we're going to project out into our future forecasted years. Here we can see those same trends persist when we look at PM emissions. And again here, when we look at greenhouse gas emissions out to 100 nautical miles from OGVs. This slide shows those same years and the surrogate at the statewide level. So those 5 years in the dark blue bars are what we're averaging to get that surrogate in the blue, light blue bar. And we can see how it impacts emissions projections out to 2050. The dashed black line showcases emissions from our prior inventory, and you can see that statewide emissions are lower than we previously estimated with the proposed updates. Future year decreases in emissions are primarily due to the transition in the fraction of visits from OGVs with Tier 3 engines. And to make that more clear, we can look at the forecast from PM. This slide showing the same information, but again, PM emissions out to 100 nautical miles. Again, only NOx is impacted by tiered engine standard, excuse me. So there's no future year reduction seen here, but what you do see is the growth rate over time. We have a similar slide for trends for greenhouse gas emissions for those interested. Again, similar trend, steady growth over time. In this slide, we're breaking out statewide NOx emissions by activity mode, where you can see overall emissions are lower than what we previously estimated, but also that ocean-going vessels are primarily have emissions that are primarily coming from transiting operations statewide out to 100 nautical miles. Here's that same information, but for PM, and you can see that steady growth over time. And similarly, again, for those interested in greenhouse gases, we have the same takeaway message here. Now, I know it's hard to see at birth in these slides because of the sheer magnitude of transit emissions. So on this slide, we've pulled out just NOx emissions from OGVs at birth. This makes it a little bit easier for us to see those emissions reductions happening in 2023, 2025, and 2027 from the recently or amended in 2020 at birth regulation. We've also put in a reference in the dotted line for where emissions are estimated to be in a case without the at birth regulation. So as you can see here, we've made considerable reductions with our existing regulatory actions, but the prior slides remind us that we still have a long way to go to reduce emissions from this sector. Now we're transitioning from our statewide summaries to a similar set of slides, but focusing on South Coast. Each area across the state is unique in terms of vessel activities and characteristics from the ships visiting. Here we can see that within South Coast, emissions are estimated to be higher than what was previously estimated, though we do still see decrease over time from the increased visits from Tier 3 ships. In this next slide, looking at PM, it's a bit easier to see that projections are closer to what we previously estimated when we don't take into consideration those tiered adjustments that we've made this time around. Though there is a higher growth rate in this update out to 2050, as you can see, those forecasting numbers diverge in the future. Similar trends persist again for greenhouse gases out to 100 nautical miles, where we see increased growth rate compared to prior estimates for the South Coast region. And again, we're breaking out total emissions by mode. This time for South Coast, we see a similar trend that we observe statewide, where emissions are dominated by transit activities, though there seems to be higher shares of maneuvering and at berth and anchoring activities and South Coast compared to statewide estimates. This is due to the large ports of LA and Long Beach that's located in this district. This slide focused on PM makes more evident the high share of all operating modes, though transit operations still make up the largest source of emissions, even within this district. Again, greenhouse gas emissions out to 100 nautical miles for those interested. And I've also broken out at birth emissions here, similar to the statewide slide previously. We can see the impacts of requirements in 2023 and 2025, reducing emissions from OGVs at birth, as well as that dotted line reminding us where emissions would be without the at birth regulation as amended in 2020. This is a timeline of where we were at in the process. Again, today's workshop is meant to kickstart the conversation. It's a chance for us to share our draft approach, but we're eager to hear your thoughts and look at any additional data sources you might have to help us improve our methods. We'll be accepting, again, comments through the end of January, so almost 2 months, where any data or concerns received will help us revise our inventory by the end of spring next year. This baseline inventory, as the REG team mentioned, will be used in SIP planning, and then we'll reach out for further engagement when we start to develop those rulemaking scenarios. So as promised, the slide is up again. It's time for questions and comments. Again, if you're calling in by phone, that's #2 to raise your hand, *6 to toggle your microphone. We'll keep accepting verbal comments through the end of this webinar, but for any reason, if we run out of time, we do encourage you to submit your comments to our inbox. Again, that's offroadinventory@arb.ca.gov. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Corey, who will be facilitating our QA session.
Thank you, Nancy. So we're going to take a variety of the written questions, and then we'll bounce over to people with their hands raised. And just a reminder, if you had your hand raised earlier, you might have to go and check that it's still up, as it was lowered when we switched presentations. So double check that if you'd like to make a comment or question. Okay, so I'm going to start with the written comments, and we're going to go through them. The first one is from Karen Bogan, and the question is just, are the IMO, International Maritime Organization, standards or goals reflected in the forecast? And the answer to that is no. The IMO does set goals for future GHG reductions. Generally, we won't reflect things like that until there is an enforceable standard that we can look at, or we have information from shipping companies on how they're going to meet that standard, such as purchase orders or the installation of technology to meet it. So that's one. The next question is, and again, I guess on that one, if there's any companies that have made purchases or plans to meet the IMO GHG reduction standards, please reach out to us and let us know. Secondly, there's a question on the arrival date for Tier 3. As Nancy covered in the presentation, we're not projecting Tier 3 ocean-going vessel percentages to increase until after 2030, and the comment is CARB made very conservative assumptions about the prevalence of Tier 3 and clean ship technology in the last regulation, assuming no OGV Tier 3 growth through 2030, which could inflate the value of the emissions or emission reductions. So how does the emission inventory address the existence of Tier 3 OGV or other clean technologies such as dual fuel LNG? So this is a great question. So we do recognize that there have been some Tier 3 OGV that have arrived at the ports, and Nancy showed that on slide 25. However, following 2015, we're seeing only a very, very small fraction of ships, and we're not seeing growth. So we're not seeing in 2021, 2022, or 23 that the numbers are increasing as OGV Tier 3 are arriving earlier. So again, if there are any companies that have made purchase orders for Tier 3s, they have plans on the books for their Tier 3 arrivals, please reach out to us and let us know. My current assumption is based on a report completed for LA Long Beach that really looked at the ages of ships going at different global routes, and then how many keels were laid in 2015 and how long those could keep being built as Tier 2s. So currently, we think that's the most solid data, and it actually, in some cases, projected out past 2030 that we could still be seeing more Tier 2. So if your company has purchase orders or other information, we'd love to hear it. So I'll go on to the next written question. We'll take 2 or 3 more of these and then switch over to the raised hands. This is a question from Todd Osterberg. I see that the emission inventory is based on the US EPA emission factors. When were they developed? Have they been updated? And how are they developed? So EPA has a lot better information on this. I'll cover it just briefly. They have a marine working group that has OGV engine manufacturers and industry experts. They also work with the engine certification for marine engines at EPA. And so when they go through their updates, they look at the numbers coming in for certification, they look at in-use testing, and they work with manufacturers to understand engine operation. And as Nancy showed, they did update these recently, not for most of the categories, just updating tier 3 based on the latest information. So, and if you're interested in that, if you reach out, we can include a link to that. So one more question here, Sam Pornizeri. Do you happen to have the same chart, which is the tier 3 OGV by visit instead of vessel counts? Port of Long Beach inventory showing that in 2023, 10% of visits were tier 3. So I don't think we have it by vessel counts, but the inventory does work off of percent time, really. Like for each vessel visit, there's a certain amount of time that it's at the port at berth emitting, and that's what we forecast. So if they're getting significant fraction of time from tier 3 visits, we are including that in the inventory. And if you're interested, I think we could probably do a query where we look at the percent of time at berth by the different tiers instead of just a count of vessels, which gets to a similar question as a count of visits, and maybe is even more speaks to like where the emissions are really coming from. So reach out if you're interested in that. I think we could do that one pretty quickly. All right, I'm going to jump over to attendees with their hands raised. Remember, you have to unmute yourself. And I'm going to start with, and forgive the pronunciation, Shalom Tubani.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for this very elaborate presentation. I really appreciate this presentation. So it's a two-part question. I'm hoping Ms. Soriano would answer. The one question pertains to the first presentation. Some of the speakers had asked about, and you were also talking about community engagement. One thing I found that I'm sorry, I should introduce myself. I am the chair of AB 617 Bayview Hunters Point, Southeast San Francisco. I understand, you know, the DPM from OGVs is not at the set. Is something that was caught us by surprise when emission inventory came out, because through AB 617, as you know, we focus more on the stationary sources. But I'm wondering why this is not front and center. I understand if you, and then I looked at the diesel particulate matter per, you know, emissions in Long Beach or LA and all, and they're eye-popping, shocking numbers there. So you do have my point, I guess, is that you do have a community engagement through AB 617s. And the 8 districts, from what I know, work at your behest. You are the overseeing authority of the 8 districts. So trying to understand why the diesel emissions are not front and center and top of the mind for AB 617 districts from the get-go. The second part of my questions is, I guess, again, sort of relates to this. This emission inventory is great, I guess. Very detailed presentation and how you're calculating this and all of that. However, we did find through our CSC that the information that the other agencies have is not from CARB. For example, the APES map from SFDPH, they don't get the information through CARB in the district. They have their own emission inventory. And so when it comes to policy making, the one thing I'm learning is the agencies do operate in a vacuum. And how do they miss this? Like SF Port, in my opinion, in my understanding, should be working with, or any port should be working with CARB, but the port has a different inventory than CARB does, which was caught me by surprise. So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Do you want me to take the first one, Corey?
Sure.
Which I think is, you know, for us, the DPM has been front and center. So I apologize if maybe we haven't maybe made that point sufficiently. We can certainly happy to do that. I think part of what helps is what we talked about earlier, which is providing information geographically by port, which the inventory folks have done in a spreadsheet. That's really helpful. And so we'd be happy to help you look through that if you'd like to, you know, to pull out what's appropriate for your area. mean, we've been working with the Hunters Point folks for many years. I believe that we've gone and given presentations over various, rulemaking, OGB or marine rulemaking. Would be happy to come and talk or work through AB 617. And so apologies if we haven't, kind of identified those sort of key health impacts of the diesel PM, which is a carcinogen. So that's one piece. And then the second piece I wanted to say is that in this rulemaking, we are going to have a community engagement plan, and we're going to have a formal plan that we're going to bring to the communities and get your help in how do we best work with communities, and would be happy to involve you in those discussions. So that's a new component in this rulemaking. We've always strive to work with the communities, but this time we're going to have a formal plan to do that. And so would love to hear, your comments as we work through that plan. So those are the two parts of my question component.
And the only thing I'll add to the second piece is we work closely with all the ports that are willing to work with us, and we try and make our information as approachable and public as possible. One difference is the ports often focus only on vessels that are visiting their specific port, where we're trying to capture everything that's in the water. So that's why there are sometimes differences where we're capturing everything that's transiting, whether it's stopping, anchoring, near a community. There's some communities that have no ports near them, but still have OGV emissions because they're near a transit link, for example. So that's just why there's some differences, but we always encourage as much collaboration as possible. We get a lot of our data from the ports. If you see an opportunity where the port can reach out to us, or we can even reach out to them, we're always open to that. And definitely agree that collaboration is a lot more effective than people working in a vacuum.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to handle a few more questions, and then we're going to turn it back to the questions we got during the earlier regulatory program. So I'm going to go to Mark Pedro, and you should be able to unmute.
Hi, Corey. This is Mark from South Coast AQMD. I posted the question in the Q&A section, but just the question was we see that if we look at statewide emissions compared to the previous inventory, they go down, whereas for South Coast, they go up pretty substantially. Like we see, it seems that there's an increase of 20 tons in 2037 with like out of 30 tons. And so, yeah, like questions is like, what is driving this change? Is it simply that you're using different AIS activity data, or is it because the low load correction factors are higher at the 5 to 35% load, or what are the factors driving that increase?
That's a great question. So I think, as Nancy said, although we did update the methodology, most of the methodology changes don't have a huge impact. Where we are seeing a lot of differences is really just the AIS data and the, particularly for South Coast, using a 5-year average that includes a port congestion period. Even though we don't overemphasize those years, they are included in the 5-year average, another 20% value. So I think those are what's driving it for South Coast. And similarly for the state, it's dropping just due to less activity / horsepower hours. And as ships get bigger, there's more efficient TU deliveries. So I think those two are the primary reasons why we're seeing a disparity. Port congestion, although it was felt, I think, somewhat in Oakland, was, South Coast had the region where we just had, I think, at some point 100 ships waiting to dock. So it's really just AIS activity that's driving it, I'd say, rather than the methodology changes being the primary driver.
Okay, all right, yeah, we can maybe follow up. Yeah, it's like definitely a substantial increase in OGV in our area. So thanks so much.
definitely, and we're happy to meet with you in person. And we do have a large number of other comments. I just want to say, I think we're going to open it back up for the OGV regulatory team to take some questions, but if you would like to meet with us one-on-one or just exchange emails to get a clarification, Nancy has up on the screen the way to reach us. We'd be happy to either meet with you or just have a discussion. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to Jacqueline to take some of the previous questions. And anybody also who submitted a question will share that address with, and if we don't get to you today, we will reach out.
Thank you, Corey. All right, so we left off with Renee Rose, and Renee's question is, does CARB only have authority within 3 nautical miles of the coastline, since past that is international waters?
Hi, Renee. Thanks for your question. I'll start by saying that currently regulated California waters is defined out to 24 nautical miles, and our fuel regulation, the Ocean-Going Vessel Clean Fuel Regulation, is enforced out to 24 nautical miles.
All right, moving on to Colin Fleming. Colin's question is, what are CARB's intentions to match any CARB CI limits and or required CI reductions with those of fuel, EU maritime, and or potential IMO global fuel standards?
I can start with this one, and then I don't know, Bonnie, if you want to chime in. I mean, we're still looking at all of the international regulations right now, and I can't really say that we have an intention to match. What we're trying to do is get the best reductions that we need here in California. Of course, we're looking at GHGs. We're also looking at much needed NOx reductions and PM reductions as well. We are, of course, paying attention to what's happening at the international level. Melissa discussed that a little bit in her presentation. There's a lot of momentum that we think we can piggyback on. And Bonnie, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that we could harmonize with international fuel intensity standards, we'd be open to looking at that if that was a path forward, and didn't conflict with the NOx or the PM emissions reductions we have. I mean, I'm not sure that there is a carbon intensity standard fully defined yet at IMO. So I mean, we'll continue to watch it. I think there's questions about our low carbon fuel standard also, and I'll just address that too. Is that at the last board hearing, there was a language in the resolution, and if anybody's interested, you could send us a note and we'll point you to that language about us looking at, whether there are opportunities to include additional fuel types. Electricity at birth is already in the low carbon fuel standard, but whether there are opportunities to include other fuel types. And so there was language in the resolution for that. So if that comes up in a little bit, that's the answer to that question. I mean, we will be working with the low carbon fuel standard to look at those opportunities.
Thank you, Bonnie. So our next question is from Yana Prokofieva. And Yana's question is, thank you for the very informative presentation. Could you comment if CARB's current policy is supportive of the use of alternative fuels, such as methanol or ammonia, in vessels? And how are you expecting CARB's positioning to evolve in the new regulation?
Yeah, do you want me to start with that one?
Sure, if you'd like.
That one's a little, there's some nuancing here on this question. CARB has a clean fuel standard rule that was adopted went into effect in 2011, adopted, I don't know, 2007, I can't quite remember. But at that time, these alternative fuels were not really on our radar, and that rule is an in-use standard that requires distillate fuel. So there are some constraints there as to, traditionally what fuels can be used to comply with the Ocean-Going Vessel Clean Fuel Standard. We do have, under that rule, we have provisions that allow research exemptions and things like that for, vessels that would operate under those fuels. And so for right now, that's the way we would approach getting information on those fuels. We don't have a lot of information on the emissions characteristics of those fuels. And we really need that before we can really make a decision in this rulemaking as to what the real, we might have NOx information, but we might not have PM or criteria, some of the other ROG and things like that. So we really need a full understanding of what the emissions profiles of those fuels are. But we are, as Melissa showed, fuels is one of the 3 prongs of the types of strategies that we'll be considering.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Next question is from anonymous attendee. Are there opportunities for NGOs to assist with outreach?
I can say that, we'll take any assistance we can with outreach. I would recommend reaching out to our in-transit inbox if you're interested in getting involved with our regulatory outreach efforts. So we appreciate the assistance you can provide.
And also plug, for our community engagement plan that we're starting development on our community engagement plan, and really, all the assistance that we can get to find effective ways for community engagement, we're open to. So sometimes we get stuck in a lot of technical discussions and, language that maybe is not the clearest and most versatile language. So any help that you'd like to provide us, we'd be open to.
Thank you, Bonnie. So the next question is from Mike Completa, and his question is, stack capture barges are very effective serving vessels at berth, but are not approved by the U.S. Coast Guard. Off-ship approaches to emission reduction for vessels away from the pier at anchor and in transit will require USCG oversight and authorization. These independent off-ship options will effectively be harborcraft. Will they be regulated under the harborcraft rules, or will the new OGV in-transit rules cover this application?
I think there are some inconsistencies in the statement that I don't necessarily agree with. Yes, the U.S. Coast Guard is the lead agency in ensuring safety of vessels. They do not approve control equipment. So they will inspect vessels and approve the safety of the vessels. And so we continue to work with Coast Guard on the harborcraft side to ensure that, harborcraft vessels, our requirements are meet the requirements of the Coast Guard. And yes, those barges are considered harborcraft and are regulated under the harborcraft rule. Although, for example, the at-berth requirements, the emissions reductions are regulated under the at-berth regulation.
Thank you, Bonnie. Our next question is coming from Tanya R. from SFMHCF. And Tanya's asking, could you include San Francisco in your study of regulation? Along with LA Port, we would be interested in the effects on Bayview Hunters Point District.
Yeah, we can follow up with you on that. I mean, we are in the process of determining where we're going to be doing health risk assessments. And so now would be the time to have those discussions.
Next up, we have Mike LaFleur, and Mike is asking, could you elaborate a little on some examples of what you would be looking for industry stakeholders to assist with in real-time / real-world testing, such as CHC operators, ship owner / operators, etc.?
Yeah, do you want me to, I'm sorry, I'm looking, oh, Lizzie. So I think here we're talking about OGVs. So I think we're looking at, being able to test ocean-going vessels, and I'll give the floor to Lizzie. You're mute.
There you go.
Thanks, Bonnie. So yeah, we are looking to test OGVs. As mentioned previously, we're hoping to get tier 3 vessels, but tier 2, tier 1 is also useful for us, and also alternative fuel vessels. So LNG, biodiesel, ammonia in the future. But we're really looking to get this testing done in the next year. And we are looking for willing shipping companies to work with us on this testing, and it would be paid for through a contract we already have with UC Riverside. So if anybody is interested, please reach out to us and we can have a further discussion on it.
Thanks, Lizzie. I see that we've got about 9 minutes left. Bonnie, do you want us to keep going with right questions, or should we give inventory a few minutes?
I think we should give it back to inventory. That we've sort of taken up a big chunk of. I think there's a lot more questions left for inventory.
Okay.
Or some more questions.
All right, thank you. I'll take 2 more questions that are written, and then we'll go back to the attendees with hands up. It's a question from Chris. The EPA OGV emission inventory method adjusts engine load estimates for vessel drafts compared with design draft. Will California ever include that? That's a great question. It's an adjustment they make to account for how high a vessel is sitting in the water, essentially. They also have other adjustments for rough seas versus smooth seas. So we would love to include those eventually. They just require a level of data I don't think we have to apply statewide. We would need information on the draft of each vessel at all times. And some of that's included in the AIS data, but it's not consistent. So where we could get that, and sea conditions, we would love to include those factors for sure. The next one from Jamie Yates. I understand that San Pedro Bay ports have developed a queuing system to reduce the number of ships that anchor off the coast. Is there another reason anchorage emissions are still higher in San Pedro Bay ports than statewide? And then yes, they have introduced a queuing system. It reduced emissions significantly from the height of the port congestion period. And I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I think their anchorage emissions are still slightly higher because it's the largest port on the West Coast, one of the largest in the world, and there's still a large number of ships. So anchorage didn't drop to 0. It just saw the large increase due to port congestion. And then next one from, let's see. Actually, let's go over to the hands up. I said we do 2, and then I'll move on to the next up. We have Lou Browning, and I should be allowed to.
Hi, Lou Browning, ICF. First of all, I want to applaud you for doing the emission inventory. I've been doing them about 30 years, so I understand the effort you've done. I applaud you for the 5-year average. I think that's a good idea considering all the things that have happened in the past. That seems good. I have a few questions and comments. Slide 18, you calculate power based on speed. Are you using reported speed or calculated speed?
We're using, for their momentary speed, we're using AIS data to determine what speed they're going at. And AIS also confirms that by they report through AIS what their current speed is. And then for maximum speed, we're using data listed from IHS, which lists all vessels' maximum speed.
So you're using what they report and not trying to calculate it based on distance and time.
I think we confirm it based on distance and time. And AIS has tiny little quirks, but over a period, it gives us a fairly accurate picture of speed.
Okay. Yeah. If you use time and distance, it provides a lot of variation, and reported speed gives you a smoother low. Slide 21, you talk about boiler NOx and boiler. The boiler emission factors came from AP 42, probably done in the 80s, on industrial boilers running on residual fuel. Current marine auxiliary boilers running on distillate are considerably cleaner than the emission factors you're using. And I know you've done at least two or more tests through UCR of boilers on, I think one on a container ship and one on a tanker. And I believe they showed about half the NOx of the emission of the AP42 factor and about 100 times lower PM than the AP42 factor. I think it's time to update some of the emission factors on boilers, particularly tankers at berth. That's a rather large emissions.
The tanker testing was for a very new vessel, so I don't think it's representative of kind of the whole fleet. So I mean, I think to the extent that we could get additional boiler data would be helpful.
Okay. Lastly, the Mercator report, I think, is wrong. It was done a few years after 2016, and they projected nothing happening till 2030. Obviously, there are Tier 3 vessels coming in. And now, you do show 21 and 22 as low years, and of course, that's because of the pandemic. In the inventories I've looked at in 2023, they are starting to come back and increasing. So I think the Mercator report needs to be thrown out and a new report done. And those are my comments.
Thank you, Lou. And we're definitely in favor of new data collection. And I think we're going to run out of time today, but if you have concepts to help guide that, we'd be interested.
Okay, thank you.
And this Zoom webinar is booked until 3:30. Thomas, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm going to bump it to you, but we may get cut off. And just a note to everybody, again, if you have unanswered questions or you just want to meet and talk and get more clarifications, please reach out to us. With that, I'll jump to Thomas.
Thank you, Corey. Appreciate the time. Great presentation. A lot of things you've heard from me before. One of the things I wanted to raise a concern on is you guys, in establishing the baseline, are looking at a 5-year average because, as you said, you can't ignore what's previously happened, even if they're, unlikely to be repeated events. There's something that's going to happen. I'm concerned that you guys aren't taking a similar approach when it comes to forecasting, because when we look at the forecasting numbers, you're projecting over 3% growth for the ports. Between 2006 and 2023, the ports have grown less than 1% annually. Combined with the change in vessel calls, we've had lots of emission reductions. Container ship arrivals over that period are down 46%. So, I from where I sit, from what I've seen from historical trends, how those trends are likely to continue with ships getting larger, carrying more cargo, resulting in fewer vessel calls, I don't see any reason why those trends would continue. And so I'm deeply concerned that the forecast is overestimating the impact of vessels in the future. One of the things I would also ask for future workshops when you presenting data, I love slides like slide 41, the statewide NOx by mode. One thing I'd ask is for the transit portion, if you can have that banded for your 0 to 3, 3 to 24, and 24 to 100 miles. So we can see where the emissions are coming from. I think that's important to understand the geographical scope of those emissions. South Coast back in 2022 did an emissions analysis that showed the further offshore you go, the less of an impact onshore you have from those emissions. I suspect most of these emissions are near shore, but I think we should be absolutely certain as to where these emissions are occurring. I know you guys have the data, so I assume it can be plotted. And thank you for putting in the chat the link to your website with the Excel sheet. I'm already taking a look at that. I see it's 3:31 already, so I'll stop there. And thanks for the opportunity to work with you guys. And on the inventory, I'd also ask for, an in-person sort of roundtable discussion to work through these issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think I have us on the books to talk on the 19th, so we can cover it in greater detail. And the only comment I'll make there is I know when we're modeling air quality, we certainly account for distance from shore. And then as they do health risk assessment, that'll obviously be very focused on distance from receptors and where emissions actually occur versus so I think I will check if the OGV team wants to add anything before we sort of wrap up. I know there are a lot of unanswered questions, but we would be happy to work with you over the following days to discuss or get further comments.
Oh yeah, thanks, Corey. I just wanted to thank everyone for their participation. Again, just echoing Corey, if we didn't get a chance to get to your questions live today, please do send them to our OGV in Transit inbox, and we'll be happy to either get back with you via email or set up a call if that's preferred. But thank you again, and we all appreciate your attendance.